Hi everybody, welcome to the Purpose People podcast. Today I have Vernon Samuels from Young Minds, so welcome.
Thank you, Dale. Great to be here with you today.
Yeah, it's so cool. I've been trying to get you on the podcast for a while, as I often do. Just tell us a little bit about Young Minds and then we'll go backwards, forwards and deal with the present as well.
Cool. Well, Young Minds, in brief, is a national charity across the UK. It's one of the leading charities for mental health of young people under the age of 25.
Yeah.
So, whether it be a little nipper or somebody who's perhaps in that sort of employment space of 24, 25, we have services that support young people and their parents so that young people can hopefully thrive and not just struggle or just barely kind of hang on and survive.
So with Young Minds, because there's a lot been talked about in terms of young people's mental health probably being the worst that it ever has been. Is that because we recognise it now, or is it because it generally is getting worse? What would your thoughts be?
I think it's both, a bit of both. I think there is more recognition because it's talked about more.
Yeah.
And so certainly even pre-pandemic, there was a level of national profile that mental health of young people is an issue. So as far back as I think 2017, there was something like 1 in 7 young people who were struggling with some form of mental health. Mm-hmm. Over the last year or so, a number of different sources would put that figure at more of 1 in 5 young people having some sort of a mental health issue that they're struggling with. So the backdrop really says there's an issue, but then post-pandemic, we see that there are issues there. We see with the social media kind of environment that there are lots of issues and things. So I think it is a combination of that awareness and then people reporting, but then we are seeing a lot more incidents in society that actually confirm that it is an issue.
Do you see with Young Minds, do you see a certain demographic of people struggling? So what I mean by that is if they're lower towards the poverty line, do you see the mental health go up, or is it consistent across the board, would you say?
Well, I think there are a number of factors that we believe at Young Minds affect young people's mental health. And so amongst those factors, socioeconomic status, if I guess we call it as a society, is something that does affect the prevalence of mental health. But often we look at compounding factors. So ethnic background also has an impact in terms of mental health, and perhaps more importantly, we'll hopefully talk about it, how people either do nothing about it or struggle more. And so you have things of the socioeconomic status, you have things of cultural background, and you have stigma also in terms of society of mental health, which compound. And so you do have a kind of a disproportionate effect on certain parts of society over other parts of society.
Yeah, because everyone's got a story to tell, and we recognise now, I think people are being a little bit more transparent, the type of backgrounds people are from and what they're going through. As you said, it's been talked about a little bit more. I think for me it's beyond the talking part that I'm most interested in. Sure. Is what happens beyond it, because I think there is also this element of where people get trapped in that I'm from this happened to me, and now I'm the victim. Yeah. And I see a lot of that in sort of like the business world, in entrepreneurship, where all of a sudden they explain their background, but they didn't really talk too much about their life after it.
Yeah.
So let's say they're dealing with a particular problem that they've overcome, but they don't talk too much about the overcoming story. They talk about their problem continually. And I think the best stories are, I have this, but I've managed to overcome to be this. Yeah. And I think that would be where Young Minds would be coming from, is from the aspect of, we understand where you are, but we want to help you through it and out the other side. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think for me, one of those really telling things, I love to go through biographies from time to time. And there's been a number of biographies that I've gone through recently that have I think really portrayed that kind of journey.
Yeah.
And one of the perhaps more prominent stories is that of the actor David Harwood.
Okay.
And he suffered from psychosis. And it was very interesting that he talked about his background. And in his family, they never talked about mental health. And it was only when he got into his teens, went to university, and then started to struggle and had a bit of support from his friends that he realized that his father actually suffered with mental health and psychosis. And then the story went through him being sectioned for a while and being in a mental health hospital. Yeah. He didn't remember much about that, but it was really great that he then went back and tried to understand what was going on. And then for him, he then talked to several other characters. It was a BBC documentary and a book, but on the documentary, he talked to several other characters that he met in like a support group to understand some of the things that they were going through. And it was very evident that he kind of reconciled in his mind that many people live with mental health illnesses and on conditions and are looking at ways to cope.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so some of them fully recover, and he feels that he's kind of gone through his episodes and he's very much back on the straight and narrow, to use a metaphor. Other people struggle and have to learn to manage their lives with the impact of mental health struggles. But it was from my point of view, I thought it was a very telling sort of conclusion, and that was mental health is real, people experience it. Sometimes it's a family hereditary thing, other times it may be other things that trigger mental health issues, but it was about getting support where you could get it, and it was about having that desire to be more stable, I guess, in their life. And I think for me, the context overall for mental health is about, as human beings, we have to operate in different environments, whether it's home or school or workplace or business. And we want to be the best version of ourselves, to use, again, another metaphor, where we want to be able to respond in ways that help us to engage with the world around us. People can trust us with what we do and we say. We have that integrity that gives us the confidence, and other people the confidence of knowing we can, move through society in ways that show or allow us to show up in positive ways. And when we don't deal with the mental health, I think it means that very often, and I see it with a lot of the work I do with schools, people find it difficult to operate in certain environments where they need to operate. So in school, and we can hopefully talk about it a bit more, I've seen young people who are really struggling in that school environment. In fact, you see school avoidance as one of the issues that we pick up at Young Minds as an issue that people come to our parent helpline and says, look, my young person won't get out the car and go into school. And part of that is where they've not really got that support that they've needed to be able to overcome their barriers enough to be able to enter those environments. And school is for education. If you can't get in, you can't get educated. So you've now been denied a really important aspect of enriching your life, getting stronger and able to cope.
It goes back to what you're saying in terms of the compound effect. Yeah. And I think the two things which I think are quite key to mention are, there's masking it and there's managing it.
Yes.
And do you want to just for the viewers, just to explain the difference between managing and masking? Because I think, you could have any kind of mental health challenge or even a condition where you mask it.
Exactly.
Or you can actually be aware of it, understand it, and begin to manage it.
Yeah. Well, I think masking, from my understanding, is where people put up a front.
Yeah.
So they try to pretend that there's nothing wrong, and they will do their best to act as though everything is okay. And again, I use a school arena. I've had a lot of kind of dealings with young people and that sort of school scenario. And sometimes you'll get young people in school who will mask being okay, and they will get home and they will explode because that's their release.
Yeah.
And they've taken off the mask to be authentic or real. And so that masking is that front. Managing is about accepting that there's something that's a problem.
Yeah.
And what we say in Young Minds is that, especially for parents, my role is around parents, particularly supporting parents to support their young person. And we say that if a parent sees that something is not quite right with their young person, because parents and carers will know their young person if they are, something's wrong. And if they see like a persistent change in their behavior or their mood, then hopefully they can see beyond any of that masking and then look at how they can help that young person to then manage that situation by, recognizing whether it's different strategies or techniques, or whether they need to get professional intervention to be able to move through the difficulties that they have, and hopefully out the other side. The problem with the masking is it doesn't address the problem.
No, and you can get really good at masking.
Oh yes,
you could be like, you can be exceptional to the point that you're actually an actor.
Yes,
to the point that if they were giving out awards, you'd probably win an Oscar, where you pretend to be someone else and not so much.
Yes.
I think the challenge that you've talked about, which is quite a biggie, is the environment that you're actually in. And, school is an obvious one, because the poor teachers are in that environment where they're probably dealing with a class of 32 people stood there at the front teaching. And this almost like they've got to try and teach to the benefit of the wider group.
Yeah.
And so often someone that is struggling, who maybe their attention isn't quite there or their focus isn't quite there, they're almost taken out and excluded. And doing that repeatedly in itself creates that I'm different, but not in a positive sense. So how do you address that? Because obviously, working with young minds, working with schools and people like that, how do you address that? What's the solution to that, almost that problem?
Sure. I think it's a very good question. And certainly with young minds and our parent helpline, we try to support the parents to get recognition for things when they're not right, and what to do. So we have what we call a trauma-informed approach to supporting young parents that reach out to us. And part of that is about being able to listen to people, to see and validate their situation. They're being seen, they're being heard, and then it's exploring what the issues are around the point of contact. So we have trained advisors, and we have different levels of advisors that we can look at depending on what is kind of presented, whether it be on the phone line or through the web chat or something like that. And when necessary, we will use specialist clinicians or professionals who can help to understand the situation that a parent and a child may be facing. So let me give you an example. It may be that a parent contacts a helpline and says, look, my child is having huge difficulty doing that transition from primary to secondary school.
Yeah.
Huge anxiety is being caused. I don't know how to calm them down. They're getting to the point of even having hallucinations.
Wow.
To then have somebody on the other end of the phone who can help you to understand that, and by going through some structured discussion and conversation, they get to the point and they say, well, actually, your child might be suffering from autism. Did you know that? Didn't have a clue. So that revelation allows them to now think, we may need to approach this a little bit differently than we would somebody else.
Yeah.
And so what is great about that trauma-led approach, it's very much listening and then solution-orientated. So there would be some actions. What can you do to change the situation? Sometimes parents may try to access the National Health Service, CAMS service, and find that they're on a long waiting list. And on that wait, their child is languishing. So the helpline is very good at engaging the parent where they're at, but also then looking at a solution-oriented action after. Because let's face it, it's great to have somebody sympathize with you and give you an ear, and for you to be able to just kind of release all of that tension and all of that, somebody's hearing me. But if you've got no suggestions on how to move forward, tomorrow it's Groundhog Day. You're right back to where you are. So having a clear, simple action plan, maybe 2 to 3 actions that the parent will agree to do with a young person, is going to be a great way of them feeling empowered to do something, rather than, I just don't know what to do. It's really frustrating. My child is hurting. I am hurting. So a scenario like that gives the parent agency. Yeah. So what the advisors are not doing, and they're not taking over and just saying, you do this, you do that, you do that. They're saying, look, we've explored the situation. These are some options for you.
Yeah.
Which ones do you feel comfortable taking forward? And then the helpline will then possibly send them an email with supplementary information or guide them to the website on particular aspects so that they can, as I said, exercise agency. And that for us is really important, that parents do feel that they can do something positive and that is actually going to address the underlying issues to move things forward.
Yeah, for me, when you look at this, apart from the mental health aspect, which is quite key, and is almost to go that little bit deeper, is understanding how people get to that point. Because sometimes it's not necessarily a hereditary condition, it's the environment, as you talked about, the environment repeatedly living in it that begins to cause those coping mechanisms and behaviours that flow out of it. How much do you feel that, obviously we're on a podcast called the Purpose People podcast, how much do you feel a sense of purpose helps with that?
I think it's really important that people, and I guess I'll use the analogy of the American Declaration of Independence. I know we're not in America over here, but
it might be listened to by
well, let's hope that somebody connects. But in that Declaration of Independence, they talk about that people have inalienable rights, that everybody has a right for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
And it's really important that we look at those factors, those barriers, those challenges that prevent us from having that. And so there is something in terms of people needing to address some of those issues that prevent them from that kind of life. Because I believe when you are seeking liberty for yourself and others, and you're pursuing something that makes you happy and joyful and passionate, it makes you the most perhaps productive, the most effective in your contribution to society, and ultimately fulfilling your purpose.
Yeah.
So being able to, I guess, address issues around mental health is really important. And it's important, as you mentioned, environment, that we recognize some of those things in society and in our environment that keep us away from that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
One of those key things I think is worth mentioning is racism.
Yeah.
And so for a lot of Black, Asian, and racialized people, it's difficult for them to move through society with a sense of confidence and purpose when they're having to deal with stuff, or not deal with, as the case may be, that prevents them from accessing their better self. So from my perspective, I think it's important that we recognize that in terms of people's past, we all to some greater or lesser extent have trauma.
Yeah.
And it's kind of accepting that and admitting that there are things that can happen to us either directly or indirectly that may affect our perception, may affect our way that we build relationships or not, the way that we deal with problems or not. And so by recognizing that trauma is a part of life, and for us at Young Minds, having a trauma-informed approach allows us to give that level of support that's really necessary to get people away from the triggers, dropping their guards to deal with the real issues, as opposed to, well, I'll just talk about the things that are the nice things and the things that people want to hear. If you don't deal with the real issues, I think in life, you don't solve the problems. You go back to that masking thing.
Yeah, that's it. It's a layered thing, isn't it? It's like, if you've had trauma happen, it's almost like not being able to cope with it. You put things in the way to not go there. And I think you do it that long enough, you get so good at building this fort around what the issue is. And,
absolutely.
And often you're dealing with the fruit of the problem and never the root of the problem. And it's getting to be in that place where the individual's comfortable enough to go there, knowing there's probably going to be a whole heap of emotion to deal with, a whole heap of identity challenges to deal with, a deep of, dealing with issues that, in a sense, they've managed to live with for so long.
Yes.
I think for me, someone told me this, and I still think it still resonates, is that you can tell when someone's through the trauma when they don't necessarily forget, but they can look back without that emotion.
Yes.
You know,
Agreed, yeah.
so that, for instance, if they're angry about what had gone on, and it's like they go back there and they're still angry, then you go, it's not necessarily resolved. But if they can look back as almost objectively and go, well, it's still wrong what happened to me. I did learn the lessons that it taught me, not to say that they should have happened to me.
Yeah.
But I've learned enough lessons to make sure that it never happens to anybody else
Yes.
in that situation.
Yeah.
Then I think you could argue that you're dealing with it. Does
Absolutely.
that make sense?
And I can give you an example. Recently, I was a guest speaker at a conference in Bristol,
Yeah.
which was about violence amongst young people,
Yeah.
which is a bit of a concern in Bristol at this point in time. So there were a couple of other guest speakers that were there, and one of them was really interesting, and they talked about their own experience of intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
And what they'd found was that as they were growing up, they looked at their father, who was a big man on the street, very popular, and wanted to emulate their father because they wanted their father's attention.
Yeah.
And when they didn't, get it, they did different things that they weren't proud of, but they recognised after a while that was in response to that feeling of not being seen, almost neglected as a form of trauma. They then went on to have children, and some of the things that they had experienced from their father, they suddenly came to that awareness of, I'm doing this to my children.
Yeah.
And they gave this really vivid scene whereby them as a father was talking to the son who was angry, and the son was wanting to vent that anger, and he was triggered to just power up on his son, and he realized, because he had that self-awareness, hang on a minute, I need to change the script.
Yeah.
Because if I don't calm down, if I don't bring the temperature down, we'll never get through this.
No.
And all I'll do is to show my son the same thing my father did, power up on a situation, and rather than deal with it and listen and try to resolve it in a more collaborative way, that situation I thought was a great illustration of where he had done the homework on himself to be self-aware enough. So when that trigger came, he had a choice. He either went with the trigger or he went with his new understanding. And it was great to see that he was able to be educated enough to say, hang on, I need to diffuse the situation. Before I power up on my son and say, look, it's my house, I need to say, look, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you before, let's sit down. And he said the outcome of that was massive. The son felt heard and he felt connected with his son. And so there are things, I think, that we need to navigate through, which would otherwise trigger us. And if for no other kind of explanation, we need more choices as people trying to navigate through the world. As parents, there are a lot of books out there, but we don't necessarily know where and what to trust. And we don't know whether it speaks to our specific situation.
Yeah.
And so it's really important, I think, that people get specific understanding about their situation. Why? So they've got options in terms of how can they move forward as best they can for the things that are in their control, understanding not everything's in your control, but there are certain things that are in your control that you can do something about.
So, because often it's certainly within the culture is the aspects of, protecting the family name.
Yes.
Which is ingrained in an older generation, which is why it transcends generation. And particular cultures, like you argue, like the gypsy culture, for example. There is the name of the family, and everyone is now reinforcing that. But even you could go the Italian culture. You could go through. There's this aspect of the family name. And I always use this example. Is like when you were at school, there was often a child that you would remember, and it would be the Smiths are. Oh, he's another one of those Smiths guys. There's this name or this stigma attached to the name. And I think often not understanding that culture is we want to try and help some people break free out of that, because they might be like the first one that decides to get educated, or the first one to go to university, or the first one that decides, you know what, I'm going to work for a living, for example. And, for me, I've played football for a lot of, if you like, inner city football clubs where, not the wealthiest, they're in the inner city areas where there is a lot of this like if I don't do something, I'm stuck here and I want to get out, you know. But they don't want to betray the, if you like, the collective, so they still play football for that same team. But you'll get high-performing individuals still going back to where they grew up, playing for the playing for the team because they owe it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
They feel that they owe it. And, you know, I think that's brilliant. I think it's a great way. But likewise, there is that aspect of the family name where if they do want to break free, they almost feel like they're betraying the family name for wanting out of it.
Yes.
Or even moving out of the area, for example. And so it's like, well, if I move out, then I've left my family to deal with all the other stuff, you know.
It's a tricky one to navigate, and in some respects, again, looking through the lens of my role as a parent engagement officer at Young Minds, one of the things that we're looking at as an organisation is how we serve better the underserved. And what I mean by that in the context of what you were saying is that affinity, that loyalty to our culture, to our people, sometimes can be hugely counterproductive. So, you know, in a lot of communities, there is a lot of stigma around mental health. There's a lot of shame around mental health. Breaking the ranks is seen as a betrayal. And so the reality is there are many people from Black, Asian and racialized communities who don't take up the option of a free helpline service, which is a great way of supporting them to support their young people. And so part of my role is about saying, guys, there's a helpline. It's free. Use it. The expertise there is brilliant. The people are wonderful. They can really help and make a difference. But the other part is about listening and try to understand what are those barriers, whether they be cultural in the way of loyalty, whether they be a matter of honor or whatever it is. We need to listen because we need to be equipping our service development in ways to reach those people. And so we accept that everybody's experiences, trauma, background is going to have some effect on whether or not they have the confidence to step over the line, to A, admit that they need some help, and then B, to actually embrace the help that's there. And so it's really important to try and reassure people that they shouldn't try to do it by themselves. Or they shouldn't just try to bury their heads, because it seldom gets better by itself. If you see a persistent change in mood or behavior in a young person, that's probably indicating that they're in a point of struggle. And for me, it's vital if we not only have a duty of care just from a sort of a parent-child situation, but we genuinely care for our children, then we should do what's best for them, rather than thinking, well, I've got all the knowledge, I'll just keep it here, or let's just keep it suppressed in case it draws attention and we don't want that attention. We've got to be looking out for the well-being of the young person, both now but also for the future, because I think it's been shown that sometimes if there is sustained mental health struggle, it can have effects in later life when they become adults.
So from your background, because you've got, your father was quite a landmark figure, let's say, in Bristol. I'll let you share that. But what was it like for you growing up, and what things did you have to break out of?
Really good question. I think for me as a youngster growing up, couple of things I had to really break out of. When I was very young, I had a lot of respiratory problems. So physically, I didn't have a lot of resilience. That then set me apart, because I had loads of energy and would want to run around with my brothers and all the mates. But if I did, I would often get exhausted. That would then lay me up in bed for a while with a chest infection. So I was actually quite a weak, sickly kind of child. And it creates a bit of a mindset. And I hope that people watching the podcast will relate. When your parents worry about you because they think you're a bit fragile, they want to wrap you in cotton wool, you worry about yourself as well. Am I going to be strong enough to do anything? And so you kind of have to find a way of breaking out of that, rather than your mum saying, oh, he's fine because he's safe in the house. So I didn't always listen to my mother, and I would go out there and I would get ill at times, and I would have to go through the struggle of recovery. But there was something about trying to not restrict who I was, just to stay safe, because I felt that it was always very unfulfilling.
Yeah.
And so I had to kind of break out of that physical, and thankfully my athletics and my sport was something that allowed me to build up my resilience physically. But equally, as a youngster, it was very. We grew up in the inner city.
Yeah.
My family in St. Paul's, right in the heart of the inner city, because it was one of the very few places that black people could live at that time. My family then moved out to suburbia, and then we kind of faced racism full on. It was my brother and I at school, at primary school, and we had to hold our own. And that was a difficult adjustment in some respects, but what was great was it was one of the things you reflect on years and years later. Home was a safe place.
Yeah.
And we felt we had 100% backing of our parents, who were fully engaged with our life at home and at school and the places that we would go.
Which way, because you mentioned it here, and I see this as almost a bit of a leveler, or it certainly readdresses some stuff, is where we get into the areas of sport. Because I run a football team for 5-6 years, and we were probably a 70-30 split into the black and Asian versus white. So white was 30, black and Asian was 70%. And even then we would experience it. So we'd turn up to the pitches, and we knew there was a particular referee that we knew in the first 2 minutes he would always book our best player. Always. Like, it could be for the most innocuous thing, he would book him. And it was a control thing from the get-go. It was, I'm in control, and that's the way it's going to be. And you could see him, and you had to like grab hold of him and you say, listen, ignore it. All you've got to do is play well and put the ball in the back of the net. Don't worry about the referee or whatever. We collectively will deal with him. Even though you feel singled out. But it was so funny because we would turn up by the end of it, like over 5 years or whatever, we would play and we're a little waiting for it. And go, seriously? We'd look at it like, seriously? Are we still doing this? And I think, but collectively, what it did is that 30% and that 70%, it brought us together.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I love about sport. It can bring those communities together.
Yeah, it's a unifying factor.
But you did athletics, didn't you?
That's right.
Yeah. So it's probably was it a little bit different? It wasn't so teamy as like football or rugby.
I mean, in some respects, it's an individual sport in that I take the accolade if I win, and I take the responsibility if I have a disastrous day.
What was your discipline?
So I used to be a triple jumper. I always say to people it was my excuse for playing in the sandpit, really. But it was a great career. I was 10 years as an international athlete. But what I came to learn in that, although paradoxically it's an individual pursuit, it's not a relay.
Yeah.
The reality is you have a team underneath you.
Yeah.
You have your cheerleaders who, you hope are your family and your friends, and you have your coach and you have your, sports psychologist, etc. You have at that elite level, you have to have a team around you.
Yeah.
So even if you're doing an individual pursuit, as I said, you get the accolades if you get that, podium position. Underneath that, there is a team, and it's very much about understanding who's on my bus, who's on my team.
Yeah.
And as you were saying, that situation where one person was singled out, it galvanized the rest. I had a similar experience in the sense that those who were supporting me on my bus would galvanize around my efforts to try and get me in the best place for me to maximize the opportunities when they came along. And it was tough because I think you've got probably two dynamics going on. On the one hand, you've got one around talent and ability.
Yeah.
But anybody who knows anything about sport, and elite sport, will know talent and ability actually is just the entrance ticket.
Yeah.
To actually thrive, you've got to look at how can I maximize what I've got in the environment, in the arena.
Yeah.
And when you've got other factors outside of your control, you've got to understand how can I mitigate? How can I bring down the effects of those so that I can actually thrive in that situation? And so you have to look at those factors that are beyond your immediate control and look at who else is in your corner, who else can you call on, who can be your advocate, who can speak on your behalf, who can talk to the referees and pull them over to the side at halftime and say, look, we know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And when you can understand to not just play the game, but win the game of life, you've got to connect with the right people. You've got to have the right team around you. When you understand that, it means that you can actually, again, not be the most talented or have the greatest ability, but actually you may thrive better because your support team, your bus of supporters is able to kind of control those things that you can't control.
And I think that was the thing when I was running a team. It was a case of helping people be consistent.
Yeah.
So we would get like superhero games where the guys like, wow, if someone had been here from any of the elite clubs, they'd be trying to sign him up now. But in the next game, it would be a stinker, and often it could be related to what was going on at home and that sort of stuff. And it was having those deeper conversations, using the spaces before the game, using the spaces after the game, to just have those little conversations. Hey, is everything all right? How you doing? That sort of stuff. And and I learned that about leadership, that you had pockets of time and pockets of one-to-ones. And I think there's one particular football manager that literally at the start of every game made the point to almost have a conversation with a player before we kicked off. But what was uncanny was he would pick up on the conversation you had the previous game. And it was an uncanny, whether he realised he was doing it or not, but it just got you in the zone. It was fantastic. But you, going back to your sporting career, you mentioned it was elite sports. You were quite close to getting to the Olympics, is that correct?
Well, I actually did go to the Olympics.
Okay.
So
cool.
I had the awesome privilege in 1988, a few years ago, of representing Great Britain at the Seoul Olympic Games.
Brilliant.
And didn't win, but got 13th place in the world, which is not bad. I'll take that any day of the week.
It's better than me.
But it's interesting that the journey that I had to take to navigate to get there. So, some of those classic kind of what I call inflection points, those days when you say, I'm either going to press through, or I'm going to just throw it in and go and work in my uncle's laundrette or something. Yeah. There were several of those points going along that I had to make some decisions to try and continue that pursuit of purpose. Yeah. I felt I needed to express my athleticism to the best level that I could. And, one of the things that I needed to do was to get coaching. And I never forget when I was 14-year-old, my parents were split, so my home life was chaotic. I felt really embarrassed because, again, stigma wasn't something that you talked about. Yeah, and I didn't know many other classmates whose parents were going through stuff like that. Yeah. So I was trying to deal with that internally. I was struggling in the classroom. I wasn't doing particularly great in terms of academics, and I needed to find something that I could trust, that I could exercise some level of kind of efficacy to be able to put my effort in and see that there was a result. And so I'll never forget my coach said, if you trust me, I'm going to train you, and we'll train you to get to the national championship. And first I'm like, national championship? Me? Yeah. And then you say, yes. And I remember stepping over that line and doing my first training session. At the end of it, I was so exhausted that my hands were shaking with just sheer exhaustion, and feeling I've stepped over the line now. I need to keep on this pursuit. Yeah. And then that paid off, and I ended up being the national champion at age 14, best triple jumper in the country. And then a curious situation happened. So happens always a good youth athlete. We didn't have social media back then, Instagram, all the rest of that. We had Athletic Weekly magazine. Okay. And I remember vividly that was the go-to if you needed to know about anything in athletics. And there was a feature article back in 1982, I remember it vividly now, that had me there as an outstanding youngster. Now, I thought that I had the ability and the purpose to get to the Olympics. And so one of the questions I asked was, how do I get sponsorship? That was the question. So it was a bit of an interview. Yeah. And they kind of put it into the format of the magazine. And that was the last. Do you have any questions? Yes. How do you get sponsorship? How many answers do you think I got back as reply? Not one. Wow. Not one. And so I had to make a decision. I'm 18. I'm thinking, do I get to the Olympics? The Olympics at that point I would have been a 19-year-old if I went to the Olympics. And I had to make a decision. So my decision was, I'm going to go to the States. I'm going to go to American University. Okay. And I'm going to study for 4 years. It wasn't so much about the study. It was actually having an environment that knew about elite sport. Yeah. And they have the system called student athlete programs where they allow you to be supported in your academics alongside the support for your athletics. Yeah. So I had physio support. I had all the kit. I remember going to the it was one of these bigger sporting companies, very prominent, going to their warehouse and just going around literally with a shopping basket and having, loads of stuff.
Yeah.
All the food was taken care of. It was about £42,000 per year that they were investing in me.
Wow.
To help me to maximize my athletic abilities. And the kickback for them obviously was that I would then compete to my best for them and help them in their winning of the national championship. And I say, and so I say that I would have preferred to be here in Britain, but I had to make a decision that would allow me to grow.
But that's quite a big decision to make at 19.
It is, but again, if you're driven with purpose, you find a way of moving forward. And when you feel it, things are being blocked and you're asking questions and nobody's coming to your assistance, you have to look at what options you have.
So going back to almost coming full circle here, is that was a young mind doing what was necessary to get to where they need to get to.
Yes.
So what would you say were the key things that, even looking back now, that you think you had or you were employing mentally to be able to make those decisions?
Yeah, well, I think there's several factors there. One of them is aspiration.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is a hunger to achieve. Sometimes we can have a great dream. We get up in the morning like, I'm going to be world champion. And then by lunchtime, that's worn off to, well, maybe I'll get to the first team.
Yeah, I had a few players like that.
So hunger to achieve, really important.
Yeah.
And it really means that if there's barriers there, you find a way because of that hunger. Mental toughness, you will always get setbacks.
Yeah.
Injuries, you will get not being selected for the team. There's a million and one things, but you've actually got to have the ability to bounce back.
Yeah.
Because without that, again, it's an excuse. And I come across every now and then some of the athletes I used to compete against or with at school, and they would say, I would have been as good as you, but, and they'll rattle down the list of things that happen. And you just think, I understand that, I get that. But we all have our cross to bear, is whether or not you will bounce back when something doesn't quite work out. Yeah?
Do you know what's really funny about that? Because, I always joke, when you get around a load of footballers, every guy that's played football has got some hard luck story of why injuries curtailed their career or they didn't get on with their coach or something like that. And, and I think, and this might be a question to ask, is you, obviously you said you finished 13th. What do you, and I think this conversation comes as a result of maturity, because you can look back. So certainly with me now, I can look back and go, I wasn't good enough. But at the time, there was no way I was going to admit that. Yeah, I was going to do whatever I could to be good enough. What do you think set you apart? And you can not answer this, but it's probably set you apart from finishing 13th to winning gold. What do you think were because you put all this effort in, all this thing. What do you think is that where that leap?
Yeah.
Where do you think that comes from?
Well, I think there's two observations I would make to that question. One of them is, and I work a lot with young people and have been for many, many years. And one of the things I say is you must have your own goal. In other words, there's lots of people who want to see you on the gold medal position, of course.
Yeah.
And if somebody handed me a gold medal at the Olympics, would I take it? Absolutely, 110% times. However, what's really important, I think, is that sense of your goal.
Yeah.
And your goal might not be my goal. And so I think part of what I would call my success, and I think I was successful at getting 13th place. I mean, in the wider scheme of things, if you want to look at absolute measures, I was the first of 3 Brits that were competing there. And one of the other teammates that I had in the triple jump trio was Jonathan Edwards, who was a current world record holder.
Wow.
So my claim to fame is I beat the current world record holder at the Olympic Games.
Yeah.
But more so, I need to run my race. I can't run your race.
Yeah.
Somebody else can't run my race. And my race is about, where is my finish line? My finish line for the Olympics was getting there.
Yeah.
And I remember vividly getting there and thinking, I'm really just going to enjoy this experience. Not waste it frivolously, but understanding that when you're in that arena, let's go back to that thing I talked about before, we have to operate in an environment. And knowing that I had been selected for the British team and I was in the Olympic Village, walking around with the sporting world elite, I didn't feel I was an imposter. I felt I was genuinely, I should be there, not by accident, but by design.
Yeah.
And I fulfilled my goal, get to the Olympics. Everything on top was icing.
You know what? And I love that perspective, because I think for me, how do you put it, is if I knowing your son now, like I don't know your son, but knowing of your son, he plays basketball for the Bristol Flyers. It's almost like it's a generational thing.
Yeah.
You know, like you've inspired your son to go and play at high level sport, and you know, who knows, it could be generation 3, 4, 5 or 6 that's the total zenith of this achievement. But I don't believe it's a case of whoever gets there in your family line, it's basically standing on the shoulder of giants, as in so many people have gone before to lay the path and the foundation for that. And I think sometimes we can judge that moment of time.
Yeah.
But if you look at your background and what you come out with, to then reset, build your life, get to where you've got, it's almost like there's a progression.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
I would totally 100% agree.
That might take like a 50 years or a 100-year goal.
Yeah,
but it's I'm part of the story. I'm not all the story.
Yeah.
You know?
And I think it takes a level of humility and self-awareness to be able to even understand what I would call the bigger context of change.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you alluded, you know, my father was the first black bus driver in Bristol, who was part of the campaign that led to the first race relations legislation in this country in 1965. And my dad laid a foundation for me to build on, to lay a foundation for my son to build on.
Yeah.
What is amazing, and it's not about false humility, is that my dad, I'd like to think myself and my son, we don't play up on the reflected glory.
Yeah.
We just say, look, we got something to do, let's get on with it. Yeah. And so for me, for example, I never would really, my mum put a lot of my trophies and my medals and stuff in a little display cabinet at the Museum of Mum, I like to call it. But for me, I remember when I got married and moved out, I just kind of chucked them in a box and they went into the attic. Because the thing for me was, I want the confidence of looking back to say, I was my best version of myself in the arena. Didn't always win, but I could show up and show out. And that for me was what it was all about. And my dad has kind of proved that in his life. My mum as well, but she's not necessarily had the spotlight. She's done amazing things. My parents have done amazing things. They showed up. They came to a country they were invited to. They showed up. And when the pressure was on, they still showed out. They worked hard. They had a great ethos. They worked to support the family. They had great friends, etc. We've inherited some of that. And we've moved on. My era, I had to find something that I could express myself in. I showed up and I showed out for 10 years as an international. Yeah. You know, my son, my wife and I agree, we would never push our children in sport or, you know, whichever way, but we would support them. And again, he's shown that hunger to show up. Yeah. You know, is there development stuff he still needs to do? Absolutely. But he shows up and he shows out. Yeah. And I love that as a father. We don't make a big fuss of it, but we acknowledge that it's really important that you bring the best version of yourself on any given day to the arena and you put it out there.
But that's what I like about what you're doing, because ultimately Young Minds, in a sense, is being that champion behind, is being that support team behind an individual when they haven't necessarily got that.
Yes.
And stepping in and saying, look, we know where life can be tough. We know where you're coming from. We know you're struggling, but let us be that team to help you be the champion in your own story.
Absolutely.
You know, is what resets generations. And I think this is what I love when we talk about this stuff, is because change is not done in one generation. No. Change is done after many generations. And I think people almost get impatient and almost, it's only when you get older and you look back and go, wow, okay, this is going to take a bit of time. And I think that maturity, I guess, lets you realize it's going to take time to turn the tide and change things rather than wanting it done now.
But paradoxically, you see, I think we live in a society which says it needs to happen today.
100%.
And then people get really discouraged when it doesn't happen today. Yeah. And then they give up. Yeah. And you know, the struggle, I often look at it as a metaphor for a relay race. Yeah. Yeah. Somebody is the incoming runner who's passing you the baton. You've got a leg of the journey that you are taking, but you are passing that baton to somebody else who will pass it to somebody else, who will pass it to somebody else. And I think it's about a better perspective of who we are as people and understanding that we may go through different challenges, we may go through different ups and downs. It's about the consistency of being able to show up each time and move forward, but also understanding that we do need that support. We can't do it by ourselves. And I often say to young people, do not buy into the illusion that there are self-made people out there. People who are successful, if you push and probe enough, you will see there are key people in their lives
100%.
that are underpinning that success.
Yeah.
And it's really important that we understand those people that we need to bring in, that, as you say, the likes of the advice and the support that Young Minds can give as an organisation. But equally, Young Minds advocates on behalf of young people and will make petitions to the government to say, look, the state has a certain role to play in making things better. It's not good enough what we've got. We can't change it individually. The state can. The state needs to do more. So it's important that there is advocacy there at the same time as support and help. With a view then that we are changing the environment, and we're also giving the support for people to be the best version of themselves in those environments where everybody should have that right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness.
Just lastly, tell me the millimetre story. Because I think that's also a good thing to help people. So go for it. Tell us.
Yeah. So as we've talked about already, I went to the Olympics. Great journey, getting there, wonderful experience. And the way that the process works of qualification, competing in the prelims and then the finals is that you've got to hit a standard, which I hit. So got my ticket, got to the Olympics, was in the prelims. There was 46 of us, I think.
Right.
And I realized after the prelims, they have two pits going simultaneously in the qualifying. So you never quite know the full picture.
Yeah. Okay.
There's half on this one, half on that one. So I'm in my half and I'm working out where I am in that and competing. And it was after that I found out they take the best 12 to the final.
Right.
And I came 13th. Okay. So I missed the Olympic final by 1 place, and 1 centimeter was between 13th place and 12th. What is interesting, I often ask, particularly young people, how do you think I felt missing the final 1 place?
Yeah.
And most people say, oh, you must have been devastated, sir. You must have been beyond yourself. You must have been hating the situation. And I actually very calmly say, I was actually at peace with myself. Why? And I asked them, what was my goal? My goal was to get to the Olympics.
Yeah.
And so you look back, and often you have to understand life by looking back.
Yeah.
But you need to also understand, what is my goal? And that's so important.
Yeah, of course.
I was happy, although it was 1 centimeter, which, by the way, is the smallest division of measure that you can have. I could have looked back and said, oh, I was so close. But all I was given was the space and the opportunity to be the best version of myself in that space that I had.
Yeah.
And I was content. That's what I did. That was what the result was. And I was happy and proud to, come out with that result.
No, it's incredible, and I love your outlook on life, and I love the way that you've seen the journey and how you've inspired so many people, and you're inspiring people with Young Minds. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for coming, for allowing me to come in and explore and just really promote Young Minds. And I will say again, it's a free service. It's really important that parents who want to support their young people, even if they feel just maybe there might be something, but I'm not too sure, give the helpline a call, and either be reassured or be given the support to feel that you can do something to make things change for the better.
And in relation to your Declaration of Independence quote, a star in stripes. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Daryl.
Take care. Everybody, thank you for listening to the Purpose People podcast. You can obviously see us on YouTube, where you can see our wonderful setting here that we film every time we do a podcast. But you can also listen to us just in your ears on Apple, Amazon, Spotify, and Google. Please like and subscribe to YouTube, and please leave a review on our podcast. It really helps us get the message out that can help people live a life on purpose, for purpose. We want to help you make purpose a priority.